You have to, until it goes green. Yeah, mine is on. Yeah. Okay. Hello, good afternoon. I'm Anna Summers Cox. I'm the founder editor of the art newspaper, and we're incredibly honored to have Dame Julia Peyton Jones here this afternoon. She's flown in for 22 hours to see what's been happening here and to give this talk about the one particular program of the Serpentine Gallery in London. Now, just very quickly, she's going to tell you all about that, but I'm just going to give you a few details of her life, because she started life as learning painting at the Royal College of Art, and now, all these years later, is going back to painting, interesting enough. She completely transformed the Serpentine, which is a small pavilion in Hyde Park, and in which, sorry, what was that? I thought that was a comment. Can you hear? Can you hear? I tell you what, I should hold it closer. Is that better? Okay, I'll hold it like this. She turned it into the 6th most visited public gallery in London and increased its number of visitors to 1.2 million a year. It became extremely famous, partly because it was the place in central London where you would see the newest art, and art from all over the world that came in for exhibitions. It doesn't have a collection, so it's a Kunsthalle. So Basquiat, give me some more artists that you showed. Louise Bourgeois, and so on.
Agnes Martin recently at the Tate.
And then there was a moment for the newspapers. One of the other things that Julia is absolutely brilliant at is raising funds, and she was giving a fundraising dinner the night that Prince Charles appeared on television and admitted that he had been unfaithful to Princess Diana. And Princess Diana turned up at the Serpentine Gallery that evening wearing a spectacular dress. And I can tell you that from that moment onward, the popular press was following the Serpentine Gallery. Now, you don't necessarily want to have the popular press following you, but in this particular case, it was, I think, probably quite helpful subsequently. Now, that's a frivolous interlude, but not an indifferent one. There have been many performance pieces in the Serpentine Gallery, including the famous actress Tilda Swinton sleeping in a glass case, rather like a sort of aquarium, and a bubbling chocolate fountain like the ones you see here on Fridays for the morning, for the brunch, and an interesting outreach program which involved Edgware Road. For those who know London, Edgware Road is the center of the Middle Eastern community. You can smell the shishas of people sitting outside the cafes. And this was an artistic and citizens outreach program in which Christine Tomei of Ashkal Alwan in Lebanon and William Wells of Townhouse in Cairo got involved. And the first time Wal Shawki was shown in Britain was shown in the context of this particular project. In the year 2000, Julia was giving one of her big fundraising dinners, and she needed an extra space. So she went to her friend, Zaha Hadid, and said, "Will you design me a temporary building?" And that's what she did. And it became the start of 16 years of commissioning a really extraordinary and historically important series of temporary pavilions for architects, which exemplify how architecture is also art, or art is also architecture. And I think that is what Julia is going to talk about today. So Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, it's a very great honor to be here. I've been to the Middle East twice in the last 3 months. I haven't, unfortunately, been to Abu Dhabi for a bit. So when I received this invitation, I could not have been more delighted. I'm also very delighted to walk around the fair and see artists at the Serpentine shown, Whale, of course, but also Pascal Martin Taillou and many others, and to see friends amongst the galleries. So I feel, I must say, very at home, and also you've made me feel very at home. One of the things that I wanted to talk about what Anna has introduced in her very generous introduction, and we're going to go on to the first image, is to explain a little bit about how this really tiny little building, that if you're lucky, you might, in your dreams or maybe in reality, be living in a house which is something along the scale of the Serpentine. So when I started, I wondered, well, how am I going to make this really a very significant place for culture, not only in London, but also internationally? And I think about it in the Serpentine in a series of chapters. It's sited in one of the most beautiful parks in London, right in the centre of the city, very close to Knightsbridge. But as you can see, it's kind of not so big. And also, because we're in a royal park, it means that we were very limited what we could do outside the building. Prior to 1996, and the very historic occasion when Princess of Wales came in what was known as the revenge dress to dinner at the Serpentine, the building absolutely leaked like a sieve, and you could always bet on the day of an opening there would be a storm, and there were memorable occasions, including very important museum shows, where there were pools of water all over the floor. Now, anybody who runs a public institution showing art knows this is an extremely bad idea. But it didn't stop us from doing museum shows with loans from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, from the Tate in London, from the Pompidou, museums all over the world, and also private collections all over the world. 1991 was a dark time in the UK. There was really no interest in culture. The audiences for art were very, very small, and I would regularly be asked why contemporary art was important. And the association of the Princess of Wales was key to us because many, many people admired her. And so her association with us meant that if she thought it was okay, then it must be okay. Even if they continued to dislike it, they didn't say so. And that was a very, very significant difference. We renovated the building, and architecture has been a kind of theme throughout my time at the Serpentine. It wasn't planned to some degree. I mean, the building needed to be renovated. It was, as I say, leaking like a sieve. And we invited the architects, John Miller and Partners, who'd recently renovated the Whitechapel under the direction of Nick Sirota, because it was to treasure the architectural gem of the Serpentine and expand every single centimetre so it would function better as an institution. But we couldn't expand it, we couldn't build on. So we were not in that very privileged position. So we had to kind of create, the bin stall became the new entrance, and we excavated the basement. And the amount of money we raised to do that renovation, 4.2 million, is less than the amount that we raise annually now. We don't charge admission, we only get 16% of our annual budget from government. And all the time, this kind of thread, in addition to architecture throughout my time at the Serpentine, was how do you do really important work that is not restricted by what a sponsor might like to sponsor, or maybe other element of our close family and constituency thinks we should be doing. We do it because we really feel that those are important programs. After the renovation, Mike Bloomberg, who then went on to be the mayor of New York, he became a trustee. He's now chair of the Serpentine board. It's the only board that he is involved with internationally, and he is extremely hands-on. He runs the finance subcommittee, and I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, to have somebody who was extraordinarily successful at Goldman Sachs, who has a multi-billion-pound business, and was formerly mayor of New York, running the finance committee, is hilarious. He takes it unbelievably seriously. And it is to the Serpentine's extraordinary good fortune that, having been a friend of ours for such a long time, he should continue to be involved with us. He came, in fact, to the 30th anniversary, and the structure designed by Zaha Hadid. So if we can move on to the first image, please. When the Princess of Wales died, she was going to come to the 30th anniversary that was going to open the new building but she died in this tragic way that we all know. And so she, obviously, she couldn't do that, and we cancelled the gala that she was going to attend. We also lost our sponsor, Vanity Fair, because they felt that they'd done everything they could for us to realize the renovation. Now they were going on to do something different, and we were too. So the commissioning of the Zaha, who was a very dear friend, she'd already joined the board by that time. She joined the board in 1996. The commissioning of Zaha was a statement about what the Serpentine stood for. The fact that it was resolutely contemporary, unlike when we collaborated with Vanity Fair on the gala dinners of the 90s. There were no flowers. There was not one flower in the room. It was resolutely about that moment in time. It was about design. And Chris Smith, who was then Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, he came to the gala, and I asked him whether the structure could stay up because the Royal Parks only gave us permission for it to be in situ for one night. So I'm rather familiar and very comfortable with this idea of things happening at speed. I like speed because it forces you to be in the moment, and it forces you to really achieve things that perhaps with more time certainly would take longer, and for me would be less interesting. So if we move to the next one, please. Zaha also designed the furniture, and it was like a piano. It went from black to white. It was made out of a very simple MDF material. And the whole budget for this project cost the same as the marquees that we used to hire with Vanity Fair, that of course then went on to somebody else after their use with us. And the trick was to try and make it playful and to see how we could experiment to make a structure that didn't really exist before. The great question then came, after Christmas gave it his permission for it to stay on the lawn, we kept it up for the summer. We installed a cafe. Next, please. We installed a cafe, and the great decision was, what do we do the following year? And the following year was Daniel Libeskind, who was shortly after his work on the Serpentine lawn, was commissioned to do the master plan for Ground Zero, which of course was a very, very important commission of the time. And he was also under consideration to do the wing, to do a new wing for the V&A. This was made out of titanium, and next please, and was extraordinarily beautiful. And it really began the genesis of what became the Pavilion Program, which was our way of exhibiting the work of international architects who at the time of their invitation had not completed a building in England. So instead of doing an exhibition of their work in models, drawings and photographs, we did it as a built space so that people could really stand or sit or stay in the pavilion for a period of time, come to lectures and discussions and events, and experience what it was like to be in a Libeskind building. Next, please. The third in the series, out of 16 years, is by the Japanese architect Toyo Ito. By this time, we were working with Arup, the structural engineers, and the vice chairman at the time was a very extraordinarily clever structural engineer called Cecil Baumann, who went on to actually now has his own architecture practice. And this structure, which was based on an algorithm, really set Ito's work off on a different kind of trajectory, which was absolutely fascinating for us to watch, and of course fascinating for him because the partnership with Cecil really proved transformative in his work. This structure, could we go to the next one? You can see here better the example of the algorithm, was nominated when he won the Pritzker Prize, which is the Nobel Prize for Architecture, which takes place on an annual basis. This project was cited by them as one of the reasons for him winning it, and indeed was part of the exhibition of Japanese architects at the Museum of Modern Art in this year. Next, please. The great modernist Oscar Niemeyer, who designed Brasilia, I was very, very fortunate to work with. And this collaboration introduced me to Brazil. and to the great glories of that country. Architecture and design is in the DNA of that extraordinary culture. And working with Niemeyer was something very, very, very special indeed. Next. He had an office in Rio de Janeiro, and literally you sat across the table rather similarly as I'm sitting next to Anna now. He didn't have a team of architects. It was a very, very small practice. He outsourced all his drawings. And it had all the elements of his architecture. All architects were asked to use elements of their architectural language in the pavilions they designed. So in this case, it had a semi-submerged basement. It had one of his fantastic drawings on the wall. He designed the furniture also. And it was a Brazilian summer. As you can see, the yellow in front of the pavilion is actually grass, although you wouldn't know that by looking at it, because it was absolutely scorched by the sun. So it was one of those very happy alignments of context and the project itself coming together. Next. This is another interior shot. I'm afraid I broke the rule with this project so that you can actually see, and by having three images. You can see the furniture which he designed and the way that the public user space, it was completely open so the wind could come through it. And one of Oscar's signature drawings was on the wall. Next. Following that pavilion, we invited a Dutch practice because we wanted to explore a younger generation called MBRDV, who are based in Rotterdam. And they decided they would do a mountain that covered the Serpentine. Next. Oh, sorry, go back. So this, as you can see, completely obscures the gallery. In the end, it was the only project out of the 16 years that we were unable to realize because it was extraordinarily expensive. At something like £5 million, which for a temporary project was not something that we could achieve in terms of fundraising. But the idea, there was a couple of years, this year and then afterwards, Alvaro Caesar, if you can go to the next slide, Alvaro Caesar with Eduardo Soto de Muro, both architects in both years, drew that one of their first initial drawings were structures that either covered the gallery completely, MVRDB, or in this case, Caesar and Eduardo de Muro, Caesar drew a kind of anthropomorphic shape that he said was eating the gallery. Next. The inside was very, very sophisticated. It was made of wood, the only pavilion we've done that was made of wood. It was also the largest pavilion we've ever made. And again, he designed the furniture. And it was something which was very magical because it was lit by solar lighting, which was in the early days. As you can tell there, it's in the mid-2000s. And while solar lighting was definitely used, it was less evident in public spaces in London. And at night it looked like this marvelous star, these twinkling lights. It was very, very, very spectacular. Next. In 2006, Hans-Ulrich Obrist joined the gallery. We'd worked together in the early 90s when I invited him to do a show called Take Me, I'm Yours. And we continued our conversations, reconnecting at the Courtauld Gallery, sharing our love of architecture. And also we talked for a year before he came to the gallery about what does it mean to be a publicly funded institution at that point in time? What was the role of a public institution? How could it make a contribution? How could it really how could public institutions embed themselves into the culture of that city and beyond? So for me, the idea of a public space is people have to come. I want people to see the work. It's very, very demanding to do what we do. And to do shows which are empty, I think is something which is just away from my DNA. It would be a pill too difficult for me to swallow. So we engaged on this wonderful 10-year partnership where his titanic knowledge and experience added something to the gallery that was absolutely incredible, and a working partnership that was extraordinary and in many ways unique. We programmed equally, always. We were both co-director of exhibitions and programs. I was director and he was director of international projects. And whilst the titles were kind of lengthy and boring, they described incredibly well what we both did. And this was the first pavilion under Hans Ulrich's and my partnership. And we invited Rem Koolhaas to design it. Next, please. And importantly, they began the series of marathons, which were festival of ideas that took place every year, devoted to a single subject, so poetry, landscape, the manifesto, a number of subjects, which were looked at from a wide range of point of view by different protagonists. So from scientists, from architects, from painters, from poets, from theoreticians, to filmmakers, and mathematicians. It was an extraordinary kind of exploration, in-depth investigation of the subject. Rem and Hans Ulrich's project was, it took place over 24 hours. So it really was truly a marathon. And actually the Rem connection is very interesting because we were both in Beirut recently with Richard Rogers and Peter Palumbo, who was the very distinguished chairman of the Serpentine for 18 years, under whose patronage he supported this incredible architecture program. Of course, the exciting developments in the Lebanon, in Beirut, with the commissioning of the architect for the new Museum of Modern Art is a very exciting development for this region. And here you can see Rem's laid it out very much as a kind of laboratory, as a think tank. The marathon ran, and all the other programs, part of our public talks, ran on monitors all around the space. And that year, we were showing the artist Thomas Demand, and it's his frieze, which is installed inside the pavilion, which is the ivy at the top of the image. Whilst the context is firmly an art context, this is architecture. And next, please. There is only one artist who's been involved in the program, Olafur Eliasson, who did the sun at Tate Modern, which you may have seen, the great glowing orb. He also has an architecture practice in Berlin, and a very thriving architecture practice. As well as being an artist, he's also an architect. And he collaborated with Kjetil Thorsen, who they both worked on the Oslo Opera House. And they did what looked like, on the face of it, a spinning top. Next, please. And you can see inside the incredible perspective into the core of the pavilion, whereby not only could you walk around the outside, rather like the Guggenheim, the sort of procession up the space, look at the park from a very different vantage point. And of course the structure was used in a wide variety of different ways, as it always was, not only for our public programs and talks and with a cafe, but also joggers in the morning who absolutely loved it. They ran around like crazy. And so the pavilion is used from the first moment that the park is open at dawn, right until it closes at dusk. And then at night, in the summer, of course, that's 11:30 at night. And it was a very dynamic structure, and Olafur was very engaged with the pavilion as well. That year it was called the Experiment Marathon. Next. We invited Frank Gehry because extraordinary, and indeed continues to this day, that he's never completed a building in London, or indeed in England. And he collaborated with his son and the rest of his practice on this project. And it was a kind of triumphal arch. With Gehry, I always think of his work as being, he creates kind of cities, he creates passageways, he creates promenades. Next. And so you can see the way he created this view onto the gallery from the road. He is incredibly knowledgeable about and very engaged with artists in the broader sense, musicians, composers, writers, artists. And so the inaugural event here was a concert by the British composer Thomas Addis, very, very significant composer. And the canopy that covered the pavilion was a series of sort of floating, very dynamic shapes that you can see, very precarious, seemingly balanced one on top of the other, that mimicked in terms of design the doors of the Serpentine, which are these very floor-to-ceiling doors that are cut in a kind of grid pattern. And it was absolutely beautifully, beautifully realized. And Frank arrived one evening. I happened to be there, but it would have been perfectly possible that I wouldn't. And he literally turned up unannounced and said, okay, I'm here to see it. And we were like, okay, my God. And he went around the structure, and I thought, he's going to say, I don't like this, and I don't like that, and that's wrong. And he had absolutely nothing to say. There was no critique about the production, because one of the things about this project is that it's conceived from 6 months from conception to completion. Now, in this country, you work at the speed of light. So the Serpentine speed to realizing the pavilions is absolutely, that's not going to mean anything. But in construction in the UK, this is a particularly fast-paced. Next, please. Sana is a very distinguished Japanese practice, and in fact, I suppose probably if I was going to pick a country that has more architects square inch than anywhere else, I probably would pick Japan. And indeed, in this program, we've had 3 architects, all of whom were in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition of Japanese architecture. This was extraordinarily beautiful because one of the things that all of you, I'm sure, will understand, particularly coming from this wonderful climate, is that in Britain, of course, it rains. And it rains rather a lot. And when I give the architects the rainfall throughout the summer, they absolutely ignore it. And indeed, it's very difficult to manage because the pavilions have no sides. If it's cold, you feel it. If it rains, you also can feel it, depending on how robust the roof is. Next. And it was incredibly beautiful because the way this very, very thin canopy, and when I say thin, I mean not thicker than that, spread over the lawn, supported on 110 of these very, very tiny little vertical stands. And the titanium kind of melded into the sky, and depending on the weather, or it shone brightly in the sun. And the swooping and diving of the structure meant that it was very, very playful in terms of form. And so there were little spaces where children could sit and play, and then there were moments where there was a kind of auditorium that was more enclosed. But one of the things that Hans-Ulrich and I learned about this whole program is that even though the structures are so small, they have to have a number of different orientations where the experience is different. It's not the same. You don't walk in, you get it, and you leave. Next. So that this extraordinary project by Jean Nouvel, who of course is one of the people whose name must be on all of your lips with the Louvre closely guarded secret, soon to be revealed. What he did was absolutely astonishing because he decided that play would be very much part of the subject of his pavilion, and also colour, because obviously the contrast between red and green makes the green greener and the red redder. So this pillar box red, London is known for its red buses, its red pillar boxes, somehow was very, very appropriate in the park. He installed backgammon sets, ping pong tables, chess sets, frisbees. So people could come here and really just experience this idea of the park as a place for recreation, a place where people just enjoyed what being in one of this incredible sort of pastoral landscape could offer. Next. The roof, it was very dynamic as a structure. The roof opened and closed. And there have been a number of moving parts in a number of pavilions, which never have been quite fully utilized. But in the early days of this pavilion, we have an annual fundraising party called the Summer Party, which raises very important sums of money for the Serpentine. And this roof was completely open, and we were looking up into this night sky, and it was just heavenly. You could have been anywhere in the world, not London, with all the associations of London and its the coldness. Next. Peter Zumthor is the architect chosen by Michael Govan at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, to do an extraordinarily ambitious program to unite that whole cultural site. It's absolutely enormous. And he lives in a tiny village in a Swiss mountain, and yet he does these extraordinarily important projects. He's widely, widely revered. And I went to see him after participating in Davos, the World Economic Forum, to look around his studio and to see whether he might consider accepting the invitation or whether we wanted to invite him. And 2 weeks later, after my visit, he rang up and said, "I've got the scheme. I've done it." It's like, what? We didn't ask you. Even better. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that he called it a hortus conclusus. So one of the things that was so magical about this project was from the outside, it was this very severe, foreboding, kind of almost repellent, medieval kind of structure covered in this hessian with tar all over it. And when you came through this kind of passage, you came into the light in this most dramatic way, with a garden by Pete Udolph, who was the landscaper for the High Line in New York. And you were really set aside from the city. Even though you were in this beautiful park, it then set you aside again. Peter wouldn't allow any kind of microphones, so even at the opening, we have 80 members of the press from all over the world. This project gets very extensive coverage. He said, no, this is about quietness, it's about solitude, it's about silence. And so we were banned, we had to project our voices. Next. On the occasion of the Olympics, which was 2012, the year when Britain surprised itself by winning such a huge number of gold medals, we wanted to pay homage to what was achieved in Beijing and also talk about a collaboration that was one of the highlights of the Beijing Olympics, which was the Herzog de Meuron Ai Weiwei Bird's Nest Pavilion. So we invited the three of them to design a project, a pavilion for us. Ai Weiwei was still incarcerated. They knew each other incredibly, incredibly well. So they could have Skype design calls, which they did, which Hans-Ulrich and I participated in. And the result was this wonderful structure. Obviously, if it had only been Herzog de Meuron, they would have not been eligible because they'd done so much wonderful work with the Tate, most recently the new building that's opened. So the top of it was a kind of duck pond, really, the circular duck pond. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that underneath they played with this idea of excavation by digging down into the lawn. And of the 12 columns that supported the roof, this pond full of water, this circular disc full of water, each column was a different design as a homage to all the other architects who'd gone before. So that any of you who've been to the Serpentine will know that this piece of ground is tiny. When the pavilion goes and the grass is returned, and I used to walk to the path to the gallery, I used to marvel at how this tiny plot of land could have accommodated all these really seminally important architects, and how their schemes were so ambitious, and yet the scale is so small, and I suppose that's one of the tenets of the Serpentine, is that scale has never been stopped us really being ambitious or doing what we wanted to do. Next. This structure by Su Fujimoto, another Japanese architect, was the beginning of a series of commissioning younger architects to design the pavilion. Up until that point, we hadn't done it because part of the business plan of the pavilion is that we have to recoup, obviously, all the costs, and the sale makes a very significant contribution to that. Su was a young architect, or is a young architect still. He's just over his mid-40s, known to a few people in the architecture world, but not widely known in the architecture world or beyond. And I think it's true to say that this pavilion really launched his practice, his office, in a way that prior to that, the recognition of what he was doing was just not there. Next, please. And he designed this structure around the grid. The grid in art is just one of the ongoing themes of exploration by artists over many centuries. And what was so interesting is that Sol LeWitt, who is one of the artists who perhaps comes to mind most, who use the grid in their work, Su neither knew of his work, but he made a structure that he wanted to be transparent. He wanted people to be able to use it, so people could sit on different levels up the structure, but he also wanted it to be a way that you actually could look through and into the park. And one of the things that is so particular about this project is that it is as a result of teamwork. The teamwork of people who work on it is a very small group, but all the elements of it has to be like a permanent pavilion, but a permanent building, but we have to go through all the commissions that you would for a permanent building, but it is only a temporary structure. Next. Smiljan Rajic is Chilean, and this came from a model, a kind of prototype that he had in his studio. Interestingly, the Chilean architects are very, very fascinated by David Hockney. And in the offices that I visited, they almost all of them had David Hockney etchings, books of David Hockney etchings on their desk. Why? I'm not entirely sure. But what was interesting about this project, like many others, was the kind of different experiences you could have in the space. Next. So you could look from one side to the other. It was like a donut. By this time, the pavilions were being reproduced by the Mayor of London as one of the reasons why you should visit London. It was on the background to the London News, which was very important to us because it meant that the pavilions were being a kind of cultural landmark in the city, even though they were only up for a very short period. So with this pavilion, you could look from one side to another. You could look down into these wonderful stones, huge rocks that you can see just at the bottom there, which were supporting the structure that came from Yorkshire. And again, a circle rather like the Olafur Eliasson Kjetil Thorsen pavilion. Next. This is by a Spanish practice called Salgascano, again young, and they use man-made materials, plastics, and of course colour. And when I talked to them and asked them about colour, they just said, for goodness sake, what are you talking about colour? There is no colour. And I thought, well, really, this is a very fascinating difference of perception because all their work is very, very highly coloured, and no more so than this pavilion on our lawn. Next. It had an outer and inner skin. This is a bleached out photograph, so you can't see so well the colour inside the space. And so it was possible to operate in a kind of secret passage in the skin between the outer wall and the inner skin. Again, it was used for talks and discussions throughout the summer. It was, because of the plastic, it could on occasion get rather hot. But apart from that, it was a really joyful, celebratory, playful structure that really harked back in a way to Jean Nouvel in terms of colour and engagement. Next. And this is for this year by the Copenhagen-based practice, big Bjarke Ingels group, that is the largest, the architectural practice which is developing at the greatest speed. They are co-designing the Google headquarters with Thomas Heatherwick in London, and they're really ubiquitous worldwide. And what they did was something absolutely phenomenal in basically producing a series of boxes that they piled one on top of the other next. That inside was an enormous, it was a soaring space. Next, please. That you can see here, and you can see the scale with the people, so it gives you some sense of the height. That it became really like a cathedral, and everybody talks about a cathedral for art, but it's very interesting and a huge tribute to them that they managed to make a cathedral to architecture on this tiny plot of land. As always, the talks and discussions took place, and this year, exceptionally, next, we asked architects to design summer houses that responded to Queen Caroline's temple, this tiny little temple next door to the Serpentine, which is overlooked and barely used. Next. So there were 4 architects that we chose. Kunle Adeyemi, an African artist who's based in Amsterdam, who played with the interior. As you can see, the interior of the space was a punched-out version of Queen Caroline's temple. Next. Barco Liebinger, who played with the circular forms of Queen Caroline's temple. It's a series of kind of almost like bustles on a Victorian dress with the way the curve of the shape. Next. Yona Friedman, the conceptual architect, now in his 90s, who did these series of spheres and at the bottom of the structure. He installed his work, drawings of other projects that he'd done, which is the only time that an architect has had a display of their work as part of the Pavilion series. Next. And then Asif Khan, who was recently commissioned to design the Museum of London together with Stanton Williams. So this is in total 20 projects over 16 years. And as I say, it's the way of the Serpentine displaying architecture in a built form as an exhibition. And the program will continue with my successor, Jana Peel, Hans-Ulrich, who's still at the Serpentine as artistic director. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what they do this year.
Absolutely fascinating. At least I think an extraordinary gift that you gave the architects, which was to let their imagination run riot. But usually architects can only do that on paper, because when they're really building, they have to build something serious. So can you tell me something about the difference between actually working with an architect who is thinking at his most artistically and working with an artist, your direct experience?
Well, an architect, firstly, is used to having a client, and they're used to having a brief. So the Serpentine had the same brief for each architect from 2001 to today, with very minor tweaks. The sense of engagement is really entirely different, because everything about this project is predicated on commissioning. And so we commission architects in the same way as we commission artists. And that makes this program, I think, very distinctive. And it still is the only project of its kind in the Western world. There's now a sister project in Melbourne, but that is the only one. And so I suppose increasingly the project became something which was much more to do with a shaping together. And architects always say, well, the client plays a very important part in their work. I think that the directness of the response is at a very different level.
But you did it, everyone had to be done in an incredibly short time, inevitably just 1 year. So
No, 6 months.
6 months. So you'd have 6 months thinking about choosing the architect, and then 6 months for the architect to actually execute it.
In effect, actually, the reality is although we kept lists and researched and travelled and talked to our peers, we didn't really ever start thinking about who the next architect was going to be until September. The architect would be invited in November, although the architects I saw this year said, absolute stuff and nonsense, you asked us in December. But so it really is 6 months.
Did many architects turn you down?
No, very few. One turned us down who came back at another year. No.
And was there a flat fee for each architect plus the costs of making?
We paid the architects the same as we pay artists who we commission to do work, especially for the Serpentine. So it's not a fee; it's a stipend, which as you well know, Anna, means really nothing.
Yeah, yes. So, well, that's a great proof of the prestige of the organisation, and of course the wonderfulness of being able to display in the royal parks. And if you know something about 18th century parks in England, which is essentially what Hyde Park is, there was in the 18th century the practice of putting up extraordinary buildings, and they were called follies. So what you have actually done is you've recreated the folly tradition. Something I've always wondered, what happens to them after they get dismantled?
They're all sold, which is part of the business plan. And so many, they're in either Europe or there is also some in England. And so there are quite a number in the south of France, Switzerland, Ireland, and Surrey, rather ironically.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure there must be some questions from the floor. Who would like to ask Julia something?
Hanan, I see, is pressing to ask a question.
Microphone, where's Hanan? Wave? Yes.
Julia, you've obviously this is a wide range of architects. I'm really intrigued by how do you go about identifying them, besides the fact that they haven't built anything in London? Like, how do you go about deciding what's that research? Do you visit? Do you try to cover geographic areas, where they are in their career?
We work at it very, very hard because obviously it's the single most important decision we take. If we get the decision, if we make the wrong decision, then we're really, really in trouble. And thank you very much. So we really, what do? We have a huge number of dossiers. I mean, it's a really lengthy process, and it has to be, because what we're always trying to do is discover an architect who can really make an important contribution, but also can deal with the time, can also deal with the fact that they're covering the costs of their studio or their office while they do it, that they can also and will make it a priority. So in each case, we work with the principal architect. We don't work with, there is a lead architect, but we always work with the architect whose name is above the door. And so the story came back about Jean Nouvel, for example, was that he would go back after having dinner with his friends in Paris and start working again on the Pavilion. And, you know, that was part of our job, was to make sure that it was a really important project to them. And they gave it their absolute best shot. And also, we matched anything that the architects were doing ourselves. So they always work over Christmas, as we do, over New Year, as we do. I mean, obviously, we're not designing something, so relatively, our job is significantly less. But nevertheless, we're there with them at every point of the way. And it's an enormous pleasure, I should add.
Any other questions for Julia? Yes, there at the back.
Have you found that in any way that the architects you've worked with have subsequently, from making a structure that's temporary, have come back to you and told you that they've learnt anything from the temporary structures that they've then applied to more permanent structures?
So, I'm sorry, if I understood...
No, just so that they, you know, having worked on a temporary structure with you, that they've then applied what they've learnt on...
Yes, very much so. So, for example, the Toyo Ito Pavilion of, I think, 2003, that set off a whole new trajectory that I can see examples of. I can see the lineage of what he did with us and how it played out. Absolutely, 100%. And there are other examples like that. And I mean, it is, as somebody, as Anna said, a field of experimentation. That's what it's for. They don't have to design lavatories or kitchens or bathrooms, or, you know, it's something altogether. It's a different form of experimentation. But we're incredibly ambitious for the projects that they do, so that it has to be at the highest possible level. And the kind of I cite the Mies van der Rohe Pavilion always in the very early stages of all conversations with architects, which is obviously of a scale which is very small indeed, and yet it has got worldwide significance and remains one of the most important architectural landmarks after all these years, and yet the scale has got nothing to do with its position in architectural history. So that's very much a kind of touchstone for what our scheme is.
Any more? Yes? White jumper.
At what point in this 20 years of journey you felt that the project or the project working or the general management of the business plan work immaculately?
Didn't quite.
Well, if I've understood it well, whether the business plan and the project were not aligned. In other words, there was a significant difference between what the architect wanted to do and what we could afford. Is that what you were saying?
No, the whole program in a way, now you feel confident about, okay, this is going to work. Not individual projects, but the whole 20 years. At what point you felt confident about it's going to carry on? Are there any showstoppers in between that, for example, like Anna said, the architect didn't want to work with you?
Could you hold the mic a bit closer to your mouth, please? Because we're not quite hearing it here. The sound isn't very good.
I've been wondering whether there was a showstopper in these 20 years you felt this is going to be very difficult, and then at what point you felt confident, no, it's going to work. So a bit of bad and good experience in these 20 years.
So there was one project which was the mountain that covered the Serpentine by MVRDV that was too difficult for us to build. It was too difficult because it cost too much, and all the kind of health and safety practicalities made it actually impossible, unless we'd spent huge sums of money, which we neither had nor would it have been appropriate for a temporary building. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Over the top right-hand corner.
I have two questions. The first is, you spoke about bringing contemporary art onto the scene in the UK, and your goal was to extend that collection so that there was an international reflection. Art and architecture. What impact has this had on the contemporary art conversation through the Serpentine?
Can I answer that? So I don't forget it. Can I answer that first?
Yes, indeed.
It's very difficult for me to say because I'm too close to it, even though I've not been working at the Serpentine for 4 months. However, I think I'm told that the Serpentine program for architecture encouraged a level of debate and discussion and attention on architecture that didn't exist before. If that is true, then
I'm really delighted, because we're a public institution and that is our role, to inform and educate the public, but also make the public aware of some of the discussions that are happening internationally, which is why none of the architects have built in the UK, because people can't discuss the work of Frank Gehry if they haven't travelled to see one of his buildings, and that doesn't seem to me right. When I started at the Serpentine, there were many, many artists who were known, whose work was known internationally, and it was also true for them that the British public hadn't seen their work. I mean, legions of them. And, you know, I feel very pleased that we were able to include them in the Serpentine Program for the same reasons as the Pavilion Program existed.
The second question was, you're creating temporary exhibitions for the public to come to the gallery and engage. To what extent do you, well, this is the third question actually then. My question is, you take this temporary exhibition and you turn it into a permanent structure somewhere else. Have you found that your visitor numbers have gone up, and have you seen a correlation between people coming from abroad to London and visiting the Serpentine because of their engagement with one of these structures abroad?
Could we just go to the next slide, please, the next image? Thank you. So what you're referring to, the Serpentine Gallery, is this space, which was designed by Zaha Hadid, who renovated the 1805 building, that long, low building that looks a little bit like the Serpentine, on the right. And on the left is a contemporary design that we built of hers, which houses a restaurant. The programming of both spaces, because we couldn't expand the Serpentine, it wasn't been possible to build onto it, and this building became available to rent, we decided that our expansion would be in a building which was 5 minutes away from the Serpentine, but still in the Royal Park of Kensington Gardens. It also was another way of extending our commitment to architecture and also design, which is very much part of the Serpentine's program, uniquely worldwide, because the M Pavilion in Melbourne does not have a museum that it's connected to. So this is another way of asking the public to look at the work that we show of artists and architects, because there is a resonance between the exhibitions we show in both places, and one plays off the other, and that is the programmatic intention. Does that answer your question?
Do you find that you have visitors coming from abroad to the Serpentine who are saying that they are actively seeking the Serpentine as a destination because of an engagement that they've had with one of these 20 pieces that have been installed elsewhere? Have these pieces been installed in public spaces, or have they gone to
No.
private collectors?
No, we haven't had that experience. I think the projects start with us, whether they are the pavilions or whether they're the shows. We very rarely take touring shows. We initiate almost all of our programs ourselves. So when people come to see us, whether they're people who live in the UK or whether they're tourists, of which there are a great number, they see things really for the first time, rather than saying, oh, you know, I saw that show in Paris, say, or New York, or Beirut, or wherever. They might have seen the work of the artist elsewhere, because artists show internationally, obviously, and architects build internationally. But the intention of the Serpentine is to, by what we do, make a contribution to the history of that artist or architect or designer by doing something which is particular to us, and also, in that sense, particular to them.
Well, I've read that all the time that we have. Julia, I've just realized as you were talking, I think you're probably the greatest patroness of architecture of the 21st century so far. I mean, in miniature scale.
But I think that I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because it's an extraordinary project you started, and it will go down in the annals of the books of architecture forevermore. So we're greatly honoured to have you here, and thank you very much indeed.